Welcome. I'm Paul Edlin, Director of Music at Queen Mary University of London. And firstly, I'd like to thank both Professor Francis Balkwell, who is the Director of Queen Mary's Centre of the Cell, and Dr. Aoife Monks, who is the creator and driving force behind these Queen Mary conversations. Both are truly wonderful colleagues to work with, and without them, this conversation would not be happening. Now, secondly, if you wish, you can access live text. I think it's called live transcript, and you can get that by pressing the appropriate button on the bottom of your screen. And finally, please do feel free to prepare questions to ask us at the end of our conversation, which you can submit via the chat function. I think many of you may be musicians, and some of you may have hearing loss or hearing impairment and may want to ask particular questions. Although it is often presumed that you need good hearing to appreciate music, the act of hearing extends across multiple senses. Tonight, we are going to explore how we literally hear and feel music. And particularly, we will discuss how musicians with degrees of hearing impairment may fully engage at the very highest international levels in the great art of music. We will consider the needless and destructive stigma around hearing aids, not least how that stigma impacts on often brilliant working professional artists. And tonight will be a true conversation, and while I will set themes and fundamental questions, I invite all the panelists to feel fully free to ask each other questions and probe each other. And in terms of panelists, I am joined by some of the most eminent people on planet Earth in both the art and science of music and hearing. Dame Evelyn Glennie is the world's premier solo percussionist. She's also a composer for film, theatre and television. While Evelyn was growing up on a Scottish farm, she became drawn to percussion as her hearing declined because she could feel the sound. Evelyn has said, "Losing my hearing made me a better listener." Mr. Chris Aldren is the president of the Royal Society of Medicine section of Otology. He is internationally known as an expert ear surgeon with a particular interest in working with and supporting musicians. Chris is also a remarkably fine violinist and has exceptionally gifted musical sons, truly so. Professor John Irving is a performer and scholar, renowned for his interpretation of the works of Haydn, Beethoven, and Mozart. His books, in particular on Mozart, have become fundamental scholarly texts across the world. Finally, Atalanta Hersey is a Queen Mary alumnus, graduating in 2019 with a degree in medical genetics. She is a very, very talented oboist, and she was a wonderful president of Queen Mary's Music Society. Chris, if I may turn to you, we're going to look at the basic issues of hearing loss. And you very kindly agreed to start this conversation by giving us a presentation about how the human ear works. So if I may, I'm going to pass over to you, complete with some slides.
That is great. Well, thank you so much, Paul. It's a great pleasure to speak, and thanks so much for organizing this. Paul came along to a meeting that I ran when I took over as president of the Royal Society of Medicine section of Otology, and that was really looking at a whole variety of things, but including music and the effect of hearing loss on music. So what we're going to do, just to sort of set the scene for the conversation, is have a little look at types of hearing loss and try and get a feel for how sound works and how the ear works. So basically, there are two broad categories of hearing loss. One is what we call conductive hearing loss, where there's something stopping the sound getting to the inner ear. And that might be wax in your ear canal. It might be that you're born without an ear canal. It could be a hole in an eardrum. It could be something like fluid in the middle ear, glue ear, which is very common in children. Or it could be my particular interest in abnormality of the little ear bones. And I spend a lot of my time rebuilding these for people. Those patients usually do very well with hearing aids because their inner ear, the thing that actually changes sound into an electrical impulse, is normal. The other group are the sensory neural hearing losses. These are people who've got problems with the inner ear, with the cochlea, or damage to the acoustic nerve. And that's the sort of hearing loss that we are all doomed to get with age. And unfortunately for some of the students listening, your hearing peaks when you're about 18 to 20 and then gradually reduces for the rest of your life. So at my age, 59, I'm beginning to get some symptoms of age-related hearing loss. And for those musicians listening, noise-induced hearing loss, which we'll talk about in some detail later on, is something that you really need to be aware of, because that damages the inner ear, the noise exposure, and unfortunately that is additive to age-related hearing loss. Lots of congenital hearing losses can be sensory neural in nature. And we categorize the hearing loss as either mild, moderate, severe, or profound. And mild patients will notice problems perhaps in background noise, but not particularly on a day-to-day basis. Moderate, they're getting to an area where really hearing aids would be useful. Severe, definitely for hearing aids. And profound, if it's sensory neural, is usually so severe that hearing aids may not be helpful. So when we talk about hearing, we're looking at pitch, and the pitch perception, the frequency range that the human ear can hear, is from 20 hertz up to 20,000 when you're a young adult. If we look at a normal 88 key piano, that goes from 27 hertz to 4,000. So we can hear well off the top of the piano. And the ear is exquisitely sensitive at detecting frequency differences, 0.2% or 2 hertz at 1,000 hertz. And that's for many of our musicians with very good pitch. They will be able to tune their instruments very, very precisely because of this ability. Unfortunately, we begin to lose this really high frequency sound at the age of 20. So at my great age, 59, I can no longer hear 20,000 hertz. I can't hear 16,000 hertz at all. 12,000 hertz, I've got quite severe loss. And that's normal age-related loss, which everybody gets. And that's the same for musicians too. The ear is also incredibly sensitive at detecting sound. So at the threshold of hearing, the quietest sound we can hear, the movement, the pressure change at the stapes foot plate coming into the inner ear is less than 1 billionth of atmospheric pressure. And at the other extreme, at threshold of pain, it's 10,000 billion times higher. Now, the problem with that means we've got huge numbers to deal with. And that's why we use a decibel scale. A decibel is a logarithmic ratio, and it allows us to contract that or to explain that 130,000 billion range into 130 decibels. So when we talk about decibels, 0 decibel is set as the quietest sound that an average young adult can hear with perfect hearing. 20 decibels would be a very soft whisper. My voice speaking now is probably around about 65 decibels. A solo violin playing mezzo forte, about 85. Solo horn playing mezzo piano, 90 decibels. For Evelyn, crashing those cymbals comes in at 130 decibels. And that's really, when you're close up to the cymbals, that's getting to noise, painful noise. And jet engine, 140 dB. One of the things, because it's a logarithmic scale, what that means is that you only need 3 decibels to increase double the sound intensity or the amount of energy entering the inner ear. However, the way we hear, you need 10 decibels to make it seem twice as loud. So if we have our trumpet playing mezzo piano at 90 decibels, to get that to 93 decibels, you would need 2 identical trumpets. And you'd need 4 trumpets to make it seem twice as loud to your audience. Now, the problem with that is if we look at long-term chronic exposure of sound above 85 decibels, that is an area that is potentially beginning to damage your ears. So if you've got an average hearing noise exposure of 85 decibels for 8 hours a day, over the years, you may well see your hearing decrease. So how do we hear? So this is the pinna. This is sitting on the side of your ear, and I look at this a lot. You may have looked at it. It's quite a complex structure. And why is that? Well, it's the shape of it allows it to focus sound, and it can also help localize sound. So if you chop somebody's ears off for tumors, for instance, they'll find it much more difficult to place sound. It's got a natural resonance frequency, which boosts hearing at 5,000 hertz, and it also protects the ear canal. So if we look at this, but can you hear this? Can you just stick your thumbs up if you hear anything, Paul? There's a soundtrack that goes with this.
I can't.
You can't hear it. Okay, just 2 secs. Let's see if I can. Okay, it doesn't matter too much. Basically, what we're doing is here, we're looking down the ear canal and the sound coming with this. And as you see, the sound comes in, the ears are vibrating. This is the malleus, incus, and stapes, which are the acicular chain, and they transmit the sound through into this, the inner ear. So here's a normal eardrum with the first ear bone, the hammer or the malleus attached to it, and we could just make out the little ear bones beyond it in the air-filled middle ear space. And these are the bones that I spend my life working on. They're particularly the stapes. There's a lot of surgery on this, and this is a 1-cent coin, so you can see it's a very small little bone. And they transmit the sound through to the inner ear, and this is our cochlea, the inner, the receptor of hearing, and that has got fluid-filled compartments. And there are basically 3 fluid-filled compartments, and the sound comes through as a wave into the scala tympani, and that displaces this membrane, which moves the organ of Corti, and these little hair cells here are what's responsible for our hearing. And you can see them beautifully lined up. Now that inner ear, the cochlea, is about the size of the tip of your little finger, and inside it there are 20,000 hair cells. And it's these ones, the inner ear hair cells, which are responsible for hearing. The membrane moves, they displace, and they send an electrical signal. The outer hair cells, of which there are much more, are responsible for actually tuning the cochlea and stiffening it. And that's one of the reasons we've got such exquisite sensitivity to frequency. So here are the little hair cells, and you can see they've got little attachments to them. And as they bend, they physically open little chemical channels that allow potassium to flow into the ear. So on this one, we can see sound coming in through the scala tympani, displacing this membrane, and it comes up and displaces these little hair cells against the tectorial membrane. And as they open, as they flex, they open these little channels, and that sends an electrical impulse to the brain. The cochlea is what we call tonotopic. So the high frequencies at the bottom, it's a spiral shape with the low frequencies at the top. And the age-related changes start occurring at the bottom at the high frequencies. Now, once we go beyond the inner ear, we go into the brain, and this is where it gets really fascinating and where there's so much that we don't know. But we do know that that tonotopic representation, where different places are responsible for different frequencies, continues all the way up into the auditory cortex in the brain. And it's at this point in the brain that we begin to see the integration with other sensors, with our emotions, the perception and recognition of speech and music. So that's the exciting bit, but it's the bit we know little about. So what about hearing? Well, we talked about a decibel scale. This is a normal hearing test. So we expect someone to have hearing above 20 decibels at the top of the graph, going from low frequencies, 250 hertz, that's like middle C, up to 8,000 hertz, that's off the top of the piano. Lots of people have hearing loss. 20% of adults have got have average hearing of worse than 30 decibels in their 25 decibels in their better ear. So they've got, by definition, some hearing loss. And 30% of adults have got difficulty hearing in background noise. In my age group, 55 plus up to 74, a third reply that they've got problems with their hearing. 1 in 6 of them has got problem of at least 35 decibels, which would mean they would benefit from hearing aids. However, only 3% have a hearing aid. Interestingly, musicians on average have got slightly better hearing than the general population. They're obviously good listeners, but they also perhaps are self-selecting and having slightly better hearing. However, those that have been in orchestras for a long time tend to suffer with hearing around 4,000 hertz, which is noise induced. And also compared to the general population, they have an increased rate of tinnitus. This is what we call a speech banana. This is where the information of speech sits, coming from around 25 decibels, a quiet whisper, up to 65 decibels, with the high frequencies giving the s and the th sound and the vowels down at low frequencies. So we talked about hearing loss, conductive loss, interrupting sound reaching the ear, and sensory loss from the inner ear. And these are the sort of things that will give conductive loss: an ear full of wax, fluid in the middle ear, a perforation, or an infection of the ear. This is my area of interest. This is a stapes, a little stirrup bone, which has got abnormal bone fixing it, and I do an operation to replace that to restore hearing. And the good news for conductive hearing loss is that most of those problems can be sorted either medically or surgically by an ear surgeon such as myself. Equally, because the inner ear is normal in these patients, a hearing aid will work well. Now, if we look at sensory neural hearing loss, the causes may be age-related, noise-induced, congenital losses, maybe due to infections, rubella, meningitis, or to occasionally we can have a tumor on the nerve of hearing that gives a sensory hearing loss. This is a normal hearing test for a 60-year-old, and you can see the higher frequencies here are beginning to fall off. And this is just getting to the area where a hearing aid may be helpful. And these patients typically will complain of problems hearing noise, hearing speech in background noise. And 60-year-old musicians are likely to have this sort of hearing loss. The green area here is where you sort of okay, yellow, you're beginning to need hearing aids, and in the red area, you definitely do. And again, this is frequency against decibel loss. So here's a normal hearing test for an 80-year-old. Look how the high frequencies have gone. And basically, almost all 80-year-olds would benefit from hearing aids. So sensory neural hearing loss, the problem with this is that we don't have a way of restoring the inner ear. So hearing aids are really our only solution. And patients with very severe sensory neural hearing loss, their inner ear is sometimes so damaged that hearing aids are not particularly useful. People with sensory neural hearing loss often have other associated hearing issues, such as hyperacusis, which is an increased sensitivity to sound, where sound may be painful and certain pitches may be painful. Diploacusis, which is often very troubling for musicians, where there's a different perception of pitch between the ears. So the same sound presented will sound at a different pitch in the two ears. Distortion, and tinnitus, which is a perception of sound in the ear in the absence of a sound. And that can be buzzing, it can be hissing, it can be whistling. All of those are tinnitus. So very briefly, we're going to look at noise-induced hearing loss and then we'll move on. So the thing about noise-induced hearing loss, which is super important for musicians, it's insidious, it comes on very slowly through your career. It's irreversible due to the damage to the outer hair cells. The outer hair cell damage means that you don't hear quiet sounds, but loud sounds sound just as loud and sometimes even louder. So you have an area of what we call recruitment. The hearing loss tends to be right up at the top of the piano, around 4,000 and 6,000 hertz. And the vowel sounds tend to mask the consonants. And so initially with noise-induced hearing loss, as with age-related loss, there's problems hearing in background noise. And just for an example, if your average noise exposure is 85 decibels, after 45 years of exposure, your hearing loss will be an average added of 6 to 7 decibels. So not huge, but noticeable. If it's 90 decibels, see how it increases. So the really high levels of noise can cause considerable trouble. And this is someone who's relatively young with noise-induced hearing loss, worse at 4,000 hertz. Highest exposure with musicians tends to be in brass players. Violinists have a high exposure in their left ear. And percussionists, although they get very high peak exposure because the noise is not so continuous, they often don't have too much trouble. So I think that's all we really need to talk about right at the moment. We'll come on to noise-induced hearing loss later. So I'd like to hand back to Paul now, if that's okay.
Thank you so much, Chris, because that explains a very great deal. But by what you say, most older musicians are going to have some form of hearing impairment. They might not admit to it.
Indeed.
But hearing impairment in the music profession is not, therefore, a dirty word, is it? It's an absolute standard thing that most people will have naturally. And it's not mentioned, that, is it?
No, I think there's a certain fear of fessing up to hearing loss. And it's an inevitability. I mean, our hearing, as I said, starts to deteriorate from the age of 20. So 65-year-old musicians, even if they don't have any noise-induced hearing loss, are very likely to have some hearing loss. And it's high frequencies, and that is likely to impact a little bit how they can perceive music, differentiate instruments. But of course, your 65-year-old musician is a very seasoned professional and is very used to dealing with it. And the hearing losses come on very gradually, and they've probably compensated very well. So yes, I think you know, there's inevitability as a musician. If you turn up with hearing aids, people may question you know, your abilities, and that I think that's extremely unfair. An interesting thing I didn't mention with age-related hearing loss, there is some pretty good evidence now that for elderly people, if they don't have hearing aids, they're much more likely to develop dementia. So when we speak to 75-year-olds and suggest they might like hearing aids, they very frequently say, oh, I don't really want a hearing aid. And then when we tell them that there's quite a strong link with the development of dementia, which can be reversed by using, or that risk can be reduced by using hearing aids, we start to tell them that these hearing aids are not hearing aids, they're brain aids. And then suddenly they're very keen to try them. And of course, as with most people, if you try their hearing aids, they're often extremely helpful.
One other thing I just want to point out, of course, because you're a violinist, you make the perfect person to be dealing with the very, very highly careful, dexterous work that you have to do as a surgeon, which is another reason why music education is so very important. It is extremely fine work you have to do. It
is. I mean, you saw the stapes that I operate on. So when I'm operating on that, I use a laser, and the tip of the laser, the fiber, is 0.2 of a millimeter across. And the prostheses I typically put in are usually of the order of 1 or 2 millimeters in length. So they're very, very delicate. And I have to say, when I'm chatting to potential surgeons, you know, if they're pianists, percussionists, you know, people where they're using both their hands all the time and they've got that dexterity, I think that lends very well to surgery. There's a lot of crossover skills.
Wonderful. That was worth you coming as well. Thank you so much, Chris. Evelyn, if I may turn to you, many will know your very special journey in music and your history and about how you lost your hearing in your childhood. We've listened to Chris explaining how the ear functions, but for you, listening to music is much more about feeling music. First of all, could you tell us what your current level of hearing loss is, and then explain how you engage through feeling and what you mean by that?
Absolutely. Well, I'd just first of all like to say what a privilege it is to be here and part of this discussion, and it was a wonderful presentation by Chris. Basically, I have a severe loss in my left ear and profound in my right ear due to nerve deterioration. And what I found was that when I engaged with music, particularly percussion from the age of 12, I was dependent on hearing aids. And this was really before the time of cochlear implants, when they became, I would say, quite popular. But nevertheless, what I found was that the hearing aids really boosted the sound. So actually, I could get the impacts of sound, and I could get an awful lot of sound coming through the ear, but I wasn't able to control that sound, and I wasn't able to control the direction of that sound. And that really affected my sense of touch, my balance, my whole sensitivity as a musician. And I knew within myself, you know, the basics of dynamics and the basics of placement of sound. I was in control of my voice and everything. But what I found was that really this barrage of sound was completely and utterly escalating everything else. So I was trying to fight that and play a lot louder. And I lost basically that sensitivity of touch, which is so important for any musician. And what I found was that early on, my peripatetic percussion teacher, he struck a drum and he just waited and he said, that drum resonates. So could it be that we can actually physically feel that sound? So I took my hearing aids off, and it was quite daunting because suddenly there was really quite little sound coming through the ear. And I put my hands on the wall of the music room, and lo and behold, I could actually get that impact, which I knew I would, but it was the paying attention of the journey of that sound. So suddenly, it wasn't the ear that was giving me that information, it was the body. So it might have been a fingertip, it might have been the palm of my hand, it might have been the upper part of my arm, could have been my chest, my neck, my tummy, my feet, whatever it was. I mean, I was just not at all sure, you know, what I was actually feeling, but I realized that the body was almost becoming like a huge ear in a way. And I had to really pay attention to that information. And for me, this was an absolute turning point, because suddenly I realized that, you know, you couldn't see this vibration. Actually, you had to completely rely on the listening experience internally, what was happening. So you couldn't actually share that experience with anybody else, because they may not have felt that particular sound the same way, because it depends very much where you are in relation to the instrument, what the acoustics of the room is, what you're wearing, what you might be sitting on, or are you standing, what kind of mallet you're using, the quality of drum or marimba or whatever it is. There are so many variables there. So, and that's why live music is so important for me anyway, because it's a living experience. It's happening now. You don't try and remember what you've done in the past. You don't try and remember what you felt. You don't try and remember the tools you've used, because it has to be a new, different experience again, because nothing will be the same as before.
Now, very often we would presume that if somebody is suffering from such a reduction in their hearing, that might actually, and all the issues around it, it might actually put them off music, or they might be discouraged from music. You, of course, had an enlightened teacher. And I know at the end of this discussion, one of the things I know you want to raise is about music education and the relevance of music education. But how long a journey did you have to go through to basically relearn how to listen? How long was that? Was it a matter of months or years, or was it is it an ongoing thing?
Oh, it's definitely ongoing. I mean, I think the thing with percussion is that you're on this journey that's never ending. You're always coming across new instruments, instruments that you've never, had in your hand before. So it's really, really important to see each new experience as exactly that. And also that the player I was when I was 12 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old is different to now. The curiosity is the same, but the type of player I am is quite different, actually. But what is so important in my situation is improvisation. And improvisation will allow you to poke into areas of your instrument that is not bound by a tutor book or a system or a method. That comes from just sheer and utter childlike curiosity, really. And so there are no rules, everything is possible. And that's really, I think, the key that I was exposed to as a child, is that my teacher saw all of us as sound creators first and foremost, then musicians, because you have to understand how to build a musical sentence, a musical phrase, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then instrumentalists. Now, this is really interesting, because normally when we start playing, you're either a violinist or a vocalist or a clarinetist or a percussionist or a pianist or whatever it is. But he saw us as sound creators, and that is what we are at the end of the day. And we are the sound. So, we can line up 10 marimba players playing exactly the same piece on exactly the same marimba, using exactly the same mallets, in exactly the same acoustic and so on, and you'll have 10 different interpretations. You'll have 10 different ideas of dynamics. You'll have 10 different ideas of presence, and that's what's so interesting, really, is that I find that sound for me is like a river, a moving river. So if I'm tired, I don't hear well, I don't listen well. If I'm nervous, my sound world changes. I can sometimes overemphasize things, because I'm absolutely, those nerves kick in and they do something to your hearing. So you're not really experiencing the same things, even although you try and use the techniques of visualization. It's still not the same once you have an audience in front of you.
And finally, one of the things that I mentioned to you before is I think you have a certain choice of harmony, of timbre, a style of music that you particularly enjoy playing. And I suspect that is because you actually feel the vibrations, because if you're playing open fifths or certain chords or certain structures, particularly on the marimba and those sorts of instruments, they're going to give you a positive feeling, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, I love low sounds. You know, if I'm playing a piano duet with my pianist, I will absolutely go to the low end of the piano. I don't like high sounds. However, I have to engage with high sounds. But high sounds you're not going to feel in the same way. And I struggle to hear high frequencies. So it's very much a case of using all of the other senses and that sense of touch. And all musicians need a trusted person out into the auditorium or theatre or whatever it is to say, well, what's happening here? You know, why do we have a conductor? And if you notice orchestras with a conductor or without a conductor, you will notice a difference in their projection. You'll notice a difference in how they're engaging with other musicians, really. So yes, I love bass drums and timpani and so on, because there's time for those kind of sounds to come through the body. I appreciate slow tempos much more now. I appreciate soft sound much more than I did before. But I think this is partly your experience in embracing that acoustic as your instrument, and then all of the marimbas or the violins or whatever we have are the tools, they're the ingredients that we then paint sound with in that particular hall. So of course we're all going to create sounds that we think we can hear, we can feel, but for Mrs. Smith up in the balcony might thinking, oh, I can't hear the violins, you know. And so it's trying to understand that all of those senses are involved in the listening experience.
Yes. Thank you very much indeed, Evelyn. Well, if I may ask Atty. Atty, I got to know you at Queen Mary. I had no idea that you suffered from any hearing impairment at all. And you were principal oboe of the orchestra and a very fine principal oboist too. And it came as a surprise to me, just because you absolutely have no problem playing in an orchestra, making music at all. Could you first of all tell us about your level of hearing loss and how the comments that Evelyn has made might be relate to you?
Absolutely, thank you, Paul. I have a moderate severe hearing impairment, and Chris mentioned earlier that there are two main types of deafness, one being conductive and the other being sensory neural. I have both of those. I've been deaf since I was born. I don't know what it's like to hear normally. I don't have any, recollection of that. And I've worn hearing aids for a very long time, since I was quite small. And actually, a lot of what Evelyn said really did resonate with me. Orchestra for me, so I'm mostly an orchestral player. I don't really do very much solo work, partly because I find it very daunting and I've got no idea what's happening in the orchestra if I'm not part of that myself. But actually, being in an orchestra, there are a few really important things. So one is the conductor. I would probably say that I'm one of the most attentive people in that orchestra, watching Paul, watching his every move, reading his body language, working out what's happening. And so that allows me to understand what's happening in the orchestra, despite the fact that I can't hear it. So I really can't hear the cellos at all. I've got no idea what they're playing ever. But if I'm sat on the stool, and we rehearse in a place at Queen Mary, which is in the People's Palace, it has this lovely wooden floor and has lots of stools. And if I sit on that stool and I can see that Paul's bringing in the cellos, I can feel all of that vibration coming through the stool. And I can't hear what they're playing, but I know that they're playing and I can sense that sound. So for me, that is reassuring, because although I don't really know what anyone's doing, I'm reassured because I know what's going on, but it's not because I'm using my ears. So I think, yes, definitely, that it's not just hearing. And there's such a misconception that, if you don't have a perfect hearing, perfect level of hearing, you can't be a musician, or you can't engage the same way as someone who doesn't. But that's not true. That is not the case whatsoever. And I don't generally tell people that I'm deaf the first time I meet them, and I especially don't in an orchestra. And that's partly to do with what we've touched on about the stigma of deafness. And actually, if you say to somebody, you know, I'm a deaf musician or I have a hearing loss, they automatically treat you differently. So I don't tell anyone that. I let them get to know me first, let them see what I'm like as an oboist. And then I tell them later on and they're really surprised and they go, well, how can you be? Because you're, you know, you come in perfectly at the right time and you know exactly what's going on. But this deafness doesn't make me different to anyone else in the orchestra.
And
So yeah.
And Atty, you also play extremely well in tune, as all oboists have to. How do you play in tune? Is that muscle memory?
It is partly to do with muscle memory. So for anyone who doesn't know what an oboe looks like, it has this reed, which is about this long, and it's made of 2 bits of cane at the top. And you place that in between your lips. And it took quite a while with my oboe teacher when I was younger, but actually looking at a tuner, playing an A, and just focusing on the vibrations that I could feel in my lips, and really working out how that felt. And so if I don't have that in the right position, or you know, the reed is slightly flat or whatever, and I play that note, it doesn't feel right, it doesn't vibrate in the correct way. And so for me, that's a real reassurance, because although I'm not quite sure what I'm playing and whether or not it's perfectly in tune in terms of the sound, I trust and I rely on the vibrations that I'm feeling here, and that gives me the strength to play and know that I am in tune.
And if I may give one example, because I know when I first got to know you, and I hope you don't mind me mentioning am I allowed to mention the top B, Atty?
Of course you are.
Okay, well, you were playing top Bs, only top Bs, slightly flat. And this troubled me because I thought, how could you possibly be playing every other note bang in tune, but these high Bs constantly flat? And I remember you came into my office and I said, well, now that is bang in tune. You said, that's how that feels. Okay, I've got that. And forevermore, that high B is perfectly in tune. I think that's quite remarkable. Now we move on to music and the profession of music and the issues that musicians with hearing impairment face in that profession. John, I had the privilege of working with you for just over a year. I had absolutely no idea that you have any form of hearing impairment. And then a little bit later, you explained your hearing impairments, and you said, I don't talk about this because I don't want to lose jobs. So, John, first of all, could you tell us about your level of hearing impairment and what you meant about that comment?
Yes, I recall the conversation, Paul. I think I was actually at your home and we were talking about something entirely different, and it just sort of dropped into the conversation, didn't it? And I remember you had absolutely no idea, years since we'd been colleagues, that there was anything wrong. By comparison with what we've heard up to now, I think I could only reasonably describe my hearing loss as moderate, although obviously at times it troubles me. I was very interested with some of Chris's graphs and age of hearing loss as plotted against a graph. My right ear has not very much usable hearing, certainly not for music or also for speech. And I realize now that my normal annual audiology graph for the right ear looks not dissimilar to that of an 80-year-old. It's a bit worse than that. The left ear is considerably better, and it was interesting to plot my actual memory of my graph for the left ear against an average 60-year-old expectation. It's a bit worse than that. So I can hear quite a lot, and it's certainly improved by wearing hearing aids. Where I have difficulty, I think has already been mentioned in other contexts, it's noisy environments, is distinguishing speech clearly, because I think some of the high frequencies are long gone. My type of hearing loss is sensorineural. So I remember a very exciting journey into an MRI scanner probably about 30 years ago to try and find out what might be wrong here, and there's no physical sign of any difficulty, and so it was decided that there's something wrong somewhere along the auditory nerve. So I'm unlikely to get any better, but the audiologist said I may gain some benefit from hearing aids. Now, getting back to another part of our conversation, I suppose I was a bit reluctant to wear a physical sign of that impairment, not necessarily because it would lose me musical performing work, because back then I suppose it was fair to say I was more of an academic than a performer. So the having of hearing loss affected me in situations like committee meetings, where I couldn't always follow a conversation that was going in a particular direction quickly. It was less of a problem, I suppose, in rehearsals. So certainly less of a problem for me as a pianist, because much of the time I'm playing on my own. But thinking back to years before wearing hearing aids, from the perspective now of having some very good hearing aids, I think that probably my playing on the piano was substantially different, and it was because anything from about 2 octaves above middle C was quite difficult to hear, because most of the sound will be coming into my not very well functioning right ear. And I've got a feeling that probably my playing in terms of the balance of sound was a bit lopsided towards the treble end, simply in order to produce enough sound that I thought was a reasonable balance. Now, looking back on that from the perspective of having a good degree of correction from hearing aids, what I've discovered more and more as technology has advanced in the last 10 years particularly, is such an amazing range of colour in sound, and my ability to blend that at the keyboard differently. As Paul well knows, but others won't, the direction that my career has taken in the last 10, 15 years has been much more in the performing world and gradually leaving the academic world. So I've been more conscious of the hearing loss and the hearing aid side of things in terms of playing music with other people than I was previously. Like I don't tell people if they notice, or if they ask, or if they begin to wonder why it is that they're having to repeat which bar they want to go from about 10 times before it actually sinks in, then I have a conversation about it. Most of the people I play with are in an ensemble setting, so duos, trios, quartets, quintets, and I'm blessed by fantastic colleagues who know what they need to do in order to use the rehearsal time efficiently and get around my hearing loss. In orchestral situations, that's a very rare problem for me. I do occasionally play harpsichord or fortepiano continuo in an oratorio or something like that. That's when I really begin to feel a little bit nervous, because it's happening in a much larger space and the sound becomes a bit dissipated, a bit less clear. And if I'm the one who's supposed to be giving a note to the choir, I need to know which bar we're in and what note, if the conductor is actually asking it, he really says. C, D, E, G, they all begin to sound the same to me because I lack the consonant at the front, and more so in a larger space.
But ultimately, John,
yeah.
you've chosen to make a performing career at the time that many people who might consider they've got an advancing hearing impairment would choose to go away from it. And you don't have any difficulty playing with fellow musicians. I want to come on to that, and I'd like to sort of perhaps bring everybody into this, because there are issues beyond, I think, the physical listening and what Evelyn and Atty have been talking about, but there's also other aspects of musicianship, and that is how we relate with each other through physical gesture, through eye contact, through a whole range of almost imperceptible conversations that we have with each other while we are performing. Evelyn, you've spoken about the placing of musicians, and Atty mentioned that herself, about preferring to be within an orchestra because she can feel what's going on around her. You, of course, are a soloist, very often playing in front of an orchestra, and so unable to benefit from that actual, the vibrations that will come from all around you. How do you compensate, and what do you do to deal with those situations? And particularly if you might have a Saturday evening concert, bless the thought of a Saturday evening concert, and you've only got a Saturday afternoon rehearsal, and you might not have met that orchestra before, or indeed the conductor.
I would rarely accept such a scenario, probably. But anyway, I think, yes, it's really interesting, because for me as a percussion player, I'm used to having my instruments in different places. So sometimes the marimba might be on the violin side, sometimes it needs to be on the cello side, sometimes it needs to be within the orchestra or wherever. So percussionists are very used to moving around and being in different positions. And I think this is really important. And I'd love orchestras to mix in a way that the players up, so that we actually do have a different leader for each piece. And this would really allow the flexibility of being exposed to a different direction of the sound. So percussionists are well used to that and quite flexible. When I'm with an orchestra as a soloist, I make it very clear in the rider that the conductor has to be as far down the stage as possible, so that basically they are in front of me and they can see me, I can see them. And it means they can also see the physical movement of playing. Because it's all very well that we go into these concerts, we've obviously studied the scores, you know, so musicians will learn to read vertically as well as horizontally. So it's not as though we're just going in there, you know, not knowing anything at all. We know what the trumpets are doing at a particular time, we know what the double basses are doing, and so on and so forth. So there is that information. Therefore, the eye plays an important part in then picking that up. So what you don't know is how they're going to play that particular phrase, or how they're going to express that. So you can see it in a score, but that living entity has to be where, again, all of those senses play a part. So with the distances that you have to cover in an orchestra, you have to use the eye for that. You really do, and understand how acoustics work, in that you might have to play on top of the beat, or on the beat, or behind the beat, depending on which instrument you're actually performing with. So for example, with strings, often it takes them a little while to get into the sound, and you know, they can begin a sound and they can manipulate that sound. So they can say, oh, I just like that a little bit more round, or a little warmer, or a little thinner, or whatever it is. With brass and winds, once they've committed to that sound, they've got to have that attack. You know, there has to be that sort of air coming through. With percussion, it's the same. Bang, you know, this is it. You can't suddenly say, oh, I'll just manipulate that, once you've created, once you've brought that stick down, that is that, you know. So the whole process that goes into your thinking before you create that sound is quite different for each player, can you believe? So that thinking process and listening process is quite different. Pianist is like a percussion player. Once that finger has pressed the key, you're committed to that particular sound color. So, but yes, I do feel that it's part of our establishments and student experiences is making sure that the players are experiencing what is it like to be in desk one, or to be in the second violins, or to be fourth horn, or to be at the timpanist, and the next time the cymbal player. It's really important to have this flexibility, and this is what improvisation does, because you're walking on that stage without a score. So the audience will have a very different listening experience. They're not reading a program note on that particular piece. So we're all starting from a blank page. And sometimes you can have musicians on stage and we're looking at each other with no sound because we don't know who might actually start. We don't know what that sound is. We don't know anything. And so therefore the eye plays a huge part in just the tiny little movements, gestures that musicians will create.
Evelyn, you mentioned the positioning of the conductor. And in fact, traditionally, the positioning of a conductor is the worst possible place to hear the orchestra. Because frankly, you've only got the front desk of the strings in front of you. It's difficult to often hear the woodwind because the strings block out the woodwind. You can generally hear the brass because they just manage to make that impact. And sometimes even the percussion can be a bit obscured. So it's not a good place. So a conductor is immediately disadvantaged by the location, and they are having to use a whole range of learned skills as to what needs to be rectified and how to rectify it. I think that's a thought that's sometimes lost. If I may ask you, Atty, one of the things that you've spoken particularly about is the fact that you love this sort of human bonding and this imperceptible human bonding that goes on. And I think Evelyn was touching on that because it's this movement, this physicality. Would you like to just elaborate on that perhaps a little, Atty?
Absolutely. I mean, the first thing I'll just say is it's quite difficult to explain completely, especially if you aren't a musician. You might not know of this, but what Paul is referring to is the feeling that I get when I'm in an orchestra and I'm playing with other people. There's just such an overwhelming sense of joy, of bonding with others, and it just feels so all-encompassing. You know, you're not just there in an empty room. It feels like everything is alive. The sound is alive. The music is alive. And for me, it just brings me the utmost joy in the world. And everything is just, I mean, honestly, it's just the best thing ever. But I'm not just relying on my ears to feel that. You know, I'm feeling that throughout my entire being. And that is to do with all of those vibrations in that room. Everything is alive with energy, and in that moment I feel so utterly connected with each and every person, wherever they be in that orchestra. So it might sound a bit weird if you haven't heard of that described before, so bear with me. But yeah.
Actually, it sounds as weird as when you're playing Mozart, you just feel as if you've entered heaven. I think that's a very, very poignant thing. Evelyn, you mentioned to me one thing that I found a little troubling, and that was that you were working with a conductor who clearly was wearing hearing aids, and you were concerned that it might be more difficult for that conductor to get the recognition that they fully deserve. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Well, basically, it was only a few years ago, and it was with the orchestra in Mexico City, a very good orchestra, and this conductor was one of the regular guests there. And he was a very, very good, talented musician, especially with contemporary music. And when I first met him, you know, we were chatting. I noticed his hearing aids. I thought nothing about it, and off we went. You know, we created these concerts together. And then once I returned to my home here in the UK, I received a letter from his agent and asking if I would, you know, chat with him a little bit more and perhaps even write a reference, because he explained that, you know, as soon as people see his hearing aids in the profession, they just seem to create this wall, and he just, you know, can't seem to break down that wall. And you know, he has such a wonderful resume and history of you know, high level concerts, and it just seems such a shame that we spend so much time talking about the physicalities of playing, and you know, we talk about Tai Chi, we talk about the Alexander technique, we talk about, you know, how to keep ourselves supple and you know, eat well and healthy, and we talk about nerves and how to deal with that, and all sorts of things. But yet we don't seem to talk about the key or one very key aspect of being a musician, which is our hearing, you know, and what does that mean in relation to not just music, but in relation to the whole sound world of our instruments. My sound world is very different to Aki's sound world as an oboe player, or to John's sound world as a harpsichord player or a pianist. You know, we're dealing with very different frequencies and sense of attacks and durations and so on. And you know, how we deal with that sound and digest sound is unique to all of us. It really, really is. And when you're dealing with contemporary music, especially, whereby you may not have that historical period of as you might have with Mozart or Beethoven or whatever, is that, well, you know, we're all looking at these notes, you know, that are new to us, and how do we balance these sounds together? So it's new to us all, really. And so it's really important, I think, to be able to talk about sound in relation to hearing, in relation to listening, in relation to our creativity, whether you're a solo player or working as an ensemble.
Thank you. Chris, I want to draw on this issue of stigmas and also bring in the issue of hearing aids, because it's quite clear that there has been a tremendous advancement in hearing aids. Before we do that, though, could you describe to me some of the issues that you face with musicians that reveal the disadvantages that they feel they are placed under if they reveal their hearing loss, and the stigma that you feel still exists with hearing aids?
Well, I mean, it's a strange thing with hearing aids. People pop glasses on and they're slightly reluctant to put them on, and then they put them on and, oh, I like your glasses. You look great with glasses. They're amazing. Look so much. And so people somehow the glasses manufacturers have made it cool to wear glasses, and we take them without too much trouble. In fact, people often really like wearing their glasses. Hearing aids have traditionally been, I mean, a lot of people in my generation remember them from 40 years ago when they were big clunky things, sometimes even body worn with wires. They were generally worn predominantly by elderly people, and there is this association with aging and hearing. And of course, I've already said that that's a genuine association to make. But hearing aids have changed dramatically. The digital technology allows them to be much more frequency specific. So all hearing aids now are tuned to your audiogram. They type in the audiogram to the computer, and the hearing aid deliberately gives you the boost in the frequencies that you need. The days of whistling hearing aids are predominantly behind us, because the whistling, which is, you know, a hearing aid basically is a microphone, an amplifier, and a loudspeaker, but they're incredibly close to one another. So we all know about, you know, you hold your microphone on stage against a loudspeaker and you get this awful feedback. Well, you get that with a traditional hearing aid, but that's now digitally removed. So it allows you to have hearing aids which are what we call open fit. So if your low frequencies are good, we can allow those through without blocking the ear. So hearing aids have definitely improved. Having said that, And Evelyn touched on that very, very nicely. If you've got very severe loss of a sensory neural nature, then your receptor of hearing is fundamentally damaged, and ultimately all hearing aids do is make things louder. They may make it louder at different frequencies, but they don't restore the function of the inner ear. And therefore, if you've got really, really bad sensory hearing, hearing aids have got limited use. And Evelyn also talked about cochlear implants, which are a way of getting around that, where we actually directly stimulate with an electrode into the cochlea, and to a certain extent bypass the cochlea. We're stimulating the nerve of hearing directly. And those are absolutely extraordinary for people with no hearing. But as with the majority of money spent in hearing aids, with cochlear implants, it's all about speech, getting people to understand speech, recognizing speech. And so the focus of the hearing aid manufacturers is to get people hearing speech. And it's only latterly that they've said, well, hang on a second, what about music? And music presents different issues. So cochlear implants are fantastic for speech, life-changing for people. And these traditionally have been people who get no benefit at all from hearing aids and can hear nothing at all. And then suddenly they can hear. So that's amazing. But they're not particularly good for music. So that background of the age thing, I think, has a lot to do with the stigma. But what was interesting, I guess, about 15 years ago with Bluetooth phones, quite a lot of people would come in with a great big thing stuck on their ear, which is their Bluetooth connection to their phone. And I have a lovely slide of saying, you know, don't I look cool in this? And it's a huge thing stuck on the side. And then you say to them, well, maybe you could do with a hearing aid. They say, oh, no, I wouldn't wear a hearing aid. You know, people would see that. And you say, well, hang on a second. Now, one of the things really interesting with the technology of hearing aids now is that they're becoming super smart. So, of course, hearing aids now will talk to your phone. They can Bluetooth to your phone. But how about this? You can get hearing aids now that will talk to your phone, talk to Google Translate. So you go to France, somebody speaks to you in French, and you hear it in your ear in English. Now, when you've got that in 46 languages, which is available, people are going to say, well, I've got no hearing loss, but I'd quite like one of those hearing aids because they're super useful. When you can say to it, hey, Google, what's the name of that building over there? And it'll tell you, then people are going to want them anyway. And I think at that point, the stigma will disappear because everyone will want them, whether you've got hearing loss or not. I hope so anyway.
I hope so too. Atty, though, I remember you explaining to me a moment when you changed from your older hearing aids to your newer hearing aids, which chimes very closely exactly with what Chris was explaining. What happened when you did change? How did you? What was the feelings that you were experiencing, and how did you overcome them?
I mean, in short, it honestly was like the worst month of my life. Got this new pair of hearing aids, and when you get a hearing aid for the first time, it feels really disorientating. You know, I think that a good way to describe it would be a bit like you're in a swimming pool. You're in that big room. Everything is really, really echoey. The sound's bouncing off everything, and you're struggling to kind of make sense of what's actually being said at the other end of the room. And over time, your brain, for me at least, my brain adapts to that and starts to make sense of all of those sounds that I'm hearing. And I'd had my previous pair of hearing aids for 10 years, and the NHS kindly said, you know, it's time for you to get a new pair. This will really, really make a difference. And I put them in and I just felt like crying. I couldn't hear anything at all. It felt completely overwhelming. It sounded like everyone was talking to me through some sort of robotic voice translator. That was bad enough. And then I went to Orchestra, and I just kept taking them out. I kept doing the rehearsal with no hearing aids whatsoever, because whenever I was playing anything, it sounded like my oboe had also gone through this robotic voice translator, and the sound was kind of doing this. And although I thought that I was playing an A, you know, consistently in tune, it felt like it was going everywhere, and it was so disorientating that I kept going to Paul after the rehearsal and saying, oh, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, I just can't play the oboe, I just can't play the oboe. And in the end, I had to commit to wearing these for the whole rehearsal and just say to Paul, please, can we not do anything that has any sort of oboe solo in at all, please, because I just can't bear it. And it took several months. It took several months for my brain to adjust and then it was fine. And so if you do, if anyone here has recently got hearing aids or a family member is getting them soon, do reassure them that their brain will adjust. They will make sense of that and it will be absolutely fine. And you just have to persevere. But I think that's what puts lots of people off. They try it for the first time, especially people who are older and haven't had these before, and think, golly, this is terrible. I can't do that. I'll be fine without. But your brain is remarkable and it will adapt, and everything will be fine.
Thank you. Chris, I'm not, nobody has put any questions in apart from somebody has said, my hearing aid is Bluetooth and I love it. I'm listening to this discussion through it.
I saw that. And
yes.
I think I'd just like to reiterate what Ati said. I mean, one of the big problems we have with hearing aid users is they remember the first day they put glasses on and everything was crystal clear, and they put their hearing aid in, and they unfortunately are influenced by rather disingenuous adverts that we see in the colour supplements with old people sitting there smiling and saying, I have crystal clear hearing. And it takes time and you need to persevere. And Ati's absolutely right. If you do that, your brain will adapt to this new sensation and you'll get the most out of it. Just before I left clinic this afternoon, I had a patient with exactly that. And I just had to say, hang on in there, you know, it'll come right. Sorry.
No, we have actually got some questions coming in. I do want to just raise two other issues because I know these are particularly relevant to you. Chris, prevention of hearing impairment. Could you explain some of the things that you feel musicians and orchestral musicians should take very seriously, and what orchestral managers or orchestral general directors or whatever should be considering on what they're not doing, and some of the sorts of convoluted journeys musicians are going through to, you know, stick earplugs in but reject sound bafflers, which is in itself quite baffling.
Yeah, well, I think it's, you know, this sort of discussion is great, and I think musicians are really probably recognized for a long time that there are issues with sitting in an orchestra or in a rock band for many years. But the law's changed as well. And the law has gradually over time reduced the threshold at which they recognize that persistent sound exposure can cause damage. And that's been set at 85 decibels. What that means is not hitting a cymbal for 130 decibels and that's the end of it. It's an average noise exposure. And of course, in orchestras, there are quiet bits, there are periods when you're not playing at all. So they can look at an average across the whole time of the rehearsal. And the law looks at 85 decibels as an average over an 8-hour day. And most musicians will do sessions, and while some do 3 session days, it's often 2, so that's 6 hours. So you can go a little bit above your 85 decibels, but we've already said that a trumpet's knocking out 90 decibels at mezzo piano. So there's certainly the potential of orchestras to exceed that 85 decibel limit. And it's within the orchestra, it's a bit regional. So if you're in the brass, it's a bit noisier than it is at the front of the violins. If you're a violinist, it's noisier in your left ear than your right ear. In fact, probably one of the quietest places to be is the conductor because you're further away from it. And we know from looking at exposure that trumpets and trombones tend to get the most exposure. If you're in the string players and you're at the back of the violas or the back of the second violins, you're going to get more exposure. So I think there is a recognition now that noise is can potentially damage musicians' hearing. There's good studies looking at musicians that show that. And now at music colleges, students get their hearing checked pretty much in week 1 and they're told about this. So there is a greater acceptance amongst musicians that they need to do something about it. And that's something, it's a variety of things. It can be at the individual musician's level of wearing earplugs. The problem with earplugs, it's a bit like Ati was saying with hearing aids. You know, if you put earplugs in and start playing your oboe or your violin, it sounds very different. But if you persevere with it and you leave your earplugs in, then after a while it becomes a new normal. So people who want to use earplugs really need to invest a bit of time in it. It's probably worth buying some proper custom-made ones that have got filters that allow a very flat frequency response. But of course, there will be places where you're playing triple P, where you might need to take your hearing aids out. And so a lot of musicians will actually mark up their parts. You know, this is where the earplugs need to go in, and they'll take them and put them in. And my kids, because they're my kids and they're professional musicians, but they're my kids, they've all been told about using ear defenders from the get-go, from the days when they were in rock bands to now the days they're in professional orchestras. And they all have custom-made plugs, and they use them. And they say if you use them a lot, that's fine. Now, we talked about baffles in an orchestra. So these are very often perspex screens placed in front of, for instance, the trombones, so to protect the back desk of the violas. And they definitely do reduce sound, but sound will go around them. And of course, to a certain extent, that sound will reflect back to the trombonists. So they are of use. The orchestra can also stagger their musicians and raise the trombones and trumpets so that they're projecting over the orchestra. They actually, now they've had a great opportunity with COVID. All the orchestras that are playing at the moment are actually socially distancing. And we know if you move players further apart, that reduces their sound exposure. And there's a very interesting thing called that woodwind players, particularly in Scandinavia, use called a hearwig. And this is a device that sits behind your chair, a bit like a car head restraint. And it gives you your own personal sound plate, and you can sit into it and sit out of it. And most of the woodwind players in the Scandinavian orchestras use these. Now, I'm involved with the London Philharmonic, and I brought one over for the London Philharmonic players to try, and they were resistant to trying it, which I have to say I was a bit disappointed. It ended up going back to Sweden, but we may get it back. So the orchestras, the management are very aware of this, because many of the audience don't know, but there was a test case that went through the courts a couple of years ago of a viola player in the pit orchestra at the Royal Opera House, who in a rehearsal of Tannhäuser, where there were 6 trombones immediately behind him, got sudden change in his hearing and has not played since, and ended up with a settlement through the High Court. It went to the High Court of £750,000. So the orchestra don't want to pay that. Their insurance has gone up. So they're immediately becoming much more aware of the hearing of their musicians, which they're obliged to do by law. So I think they are making efforts. They could perhaps do more, but they are meant to make sure that hearing defense is available to their players. They are meant to make sure that it is worn. They're meant to check the hearing of their players. That unfortunately does not apply to freelance players. So the freelance players are on their own, and they need to be aware of that. So there's a lot that can be done, and I think that things are improving.
Now, from tonight's discussion, it's been very clear that you can have varying degrees of hearing impairment, and it's not going to have any impact on your ability to be an exceptional and extraordinary musician. Musicians will just find ways of working around things. We've also learned that there are a vast number of musicians who will have hearing impairment, whether they admit it or not, or whether they even know that they've got it. Before I just have a quick fire with the questions that have come in, there's one very important topic, and that is music education. And I've just got 2 very quick questions to ask both Atty and Evelyn. What would life be like for you, Atty, if you'd not had opportunity to be a musician in your early years and now?
Golly, that's a question and a half.
Has to be short answer.
I mean, music is absolutely everything to me. It's absolutely everything as a child, and all of my sense of belonging came from being able to participate in music. So without that, my life would be far worse. And that's why it is so important that any child or anyone at any age with any degree of deafness is not excluded from music because of that. That's not a reason to exclude them.
Evelyn, what would your life have been like if you hadn't had that enlightened teacher who had looked beyond the fundamental issue that you faced at that time and thought there's a way around this?
Well, I can only echo what Atty has said. I think in my case, I can differentiate music and sound. So I get a lot of pleasure from a sound because it's a physical feeling. So I could spend a lot of time with a sound. But likewise, it is this expression that it can give. It's an extra voice that you have. So sometimes I may not be able to find the words to explain or express something, but there might be a musical expression that will allow that to happen. And I would just like to say, perhaps going back to what Chris was talking about with the various avenues to protect hearing and so on, is that I do feel that this needs to perhaps be considered much, much earlier than when you're in the music establishments or in a professional orchestra or that type of thing. Because a lot of our musicians, a high percentage of our musicians are self-employed, they're not part of an orchestra. And so therefore I think that the education as regards to, you know, the wonderful presentation that Chris gave about the mechanics of hearing and what is it, you know, what are our ears having to deal with in 2021? It was very different 200 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, and so on. So really, you know, thinking about spring cleaning our sound world. What is our sound world right now? What's our sound diet? What are we actually feeding into ourselves? And I think it's the amount of sound that is the issue at the moment, I feel. So, and I do know that, you know, when you're young and you're starting playing an instrument, you're told to practice for hours and hours and hours and hours. And, you know, for many of us, that's what we have done. But actually, this is then the beginning of, you know, issues that can perhaps arise rather than, you know, small chunks, but often, just as we eat our food, you know, and what kind of frequencies are we dealing with when we are practicing? So it's kind of an awareness, an educational awareness as regards to our relationship with sound as well as the music.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I've got some very quick questions. They need to be very quickly answered. And this is a very quick one for Christopher to answer. Is the Bluetooth hearing aid available on the NHS?
What's available varies a little bit where you are in the country. Most of the hearing aids now have been taken out of the NHS and given to what are called willing providers. So they're free, but they're from Boots and Specsavers, and some of those will have Bluetooth facilities available.
Another question, I think this one is also for you, Chris. There has not been any talk yet about singers. Can a professional singer wear a hearing aid?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Singers are really a major risk of noise-induced hearing loss because sopranos will knock out over 100 decibels. And what Evelyn said is really pertinent, that a lot of the damage that people suffer is practice. And you are at conservatoire, you're playing in a small practice room, you're playing your trumpet, you're a soprano. That's really where ear defenders are useful. And a very simple app on your phone with a decibel meter is a really good place to start to get some sort of idea of what you're exposing yourself to.
Another one, I think, for you, Chris, if someone has conductive hearing loss, can sensory hearing loss in later life be additive?
Yes, it is additive. It is additive. And one question I just wanted to ask Addy, which is interesting. She said she had a mixed loss, conductive and sensory. And when you've got a mixed loss, if you've got a conductive element to your hearing loss, sound is transmitted really rather well through your mouth. And I just wonder if that might be one reason she's gone for the oboe, because some of the sound, you know, sound comes out the end of the oboe and goes in your ears, but some of it actually vibrates through the instrument and through your jaw directly to your cochlear, and it bypasses your conductive hearing loss.
Yeah, absolutely. And I started actually on the viola first, but it just wasn't the same engagement. I just did not have the same love for it. And when I tried the oboe for the first time, I just thought, this is the one for me. This just completely works.
Interesting.
There's another question here. Does being deaf offer alternative ways of appreciating and experiencing music that translates into the quality of their playing? Evelyn, I know that you'll be able to answer this one because I think the answer is yes.
Well, I don't know if it enhances the quality of my playing, but anyway, I think that it gives you a certain amount of patience with a sound, because you're allowing the body to pay attention to it and to digest it. It's as simple as that. I mean, what I find in my situation is that I don't get enough information from other players, whether it's through recordings, whether it's through YouTube or whatever, in order to change the interpretation that I give. And, you know, you don't get enough auditory information. You can obviously see how people play, but ultimately I'm 5'2", I have short arms, I have stubby hands and so on. So I have to allow the sound to work its way through the physical attributes that I have, which are going to be very different to someone who's 6 foot tall with long arms. And so really for me, it's about listening to the sound that is right for the physique that I have available to me, and that is that. So I think that, you know, when you're losing a passage in order to gain the information, there are always other passages that will open up, surprisingly, and for me that definitely has been the body, but it means that the body needs time to digest that sound and to link one sound to the next sound.
Thank you. I've got one more question for Chris, and I think this needs to be a very short answer, but it's actually a very complicated question. It is, I am a medical student. Of course, we do have one of the great medical schools, Barts in the London here. I'm a medical student and will soon be a doctor. How do you think doctors can better recognize and support you? Oh, this is for musicians, actually. No, this is actually for John, Atty, and Evelyn. How do you think doctors can better recognize and support you with your hearing impairment and your music? Evelyn.
A few months ago, I did a little session at Manchester University whereby we combined the audiology students and the musicians, and we gave a class together, and it was trying to understand the difference between having hearing measured in a controlled room that you can see in a graph to the reality of walking out onto the street or playing your instrument or whatever it might be. So, and it's trying to understand, what is it that musicians are listening to? You know, what is it that they're listening to? What are we listening to? Are we listening to the room, our instrument, our neighbor? What is it that we're listening to? And that can change, you know, all of the time, albeit in a subtle way. It will change, and it will change from player to player. And so I think that if we have, you know, a playing field whereby we can talk about these things, so talk about the mechanics of hearing, but perhaps not to confuse that with listening.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, if I may say, it has been a genuine privilege for me to be in discussion with you, a true privilege in so many ways, because you're all such important and special people, contributing to the beauty of life and the beauty of humanity through music and through medicine and the sciences and all the wonderful things that make life worthwhile. So on behalf of Queen Mary Conversations, on behalf of Queen Mary University of London, and on behalf of Music at Queen Mary and all the things that we do, please may I thank Dame Evelyn Glennie, Mr. Chris Aldren, Professor John Irving, and Atalanta Hersey. And you can all make as loud a noise as you want to at home by applauding, because we sadly can't hear you. We can only just imagine. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure.